Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're trying to get our guest coming up, Vanessa Beeley. She's an international investigative journalist, to speak about what has been taking place in Syria. There have been airstrikes. Joe Biden on Sunday carried out airstrikes against what they are calling to be, U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and in Syria. The attacks were against weapon storage facilities used by Iranian-backed militia that the Pentagon said had conducted drone strikes against places in Iraq where American troops, spies, and diplomats were located. I was able to connect with Vanessa Beeley, a journalist, earlier this morning. She covers that area. She covers that area fantastically. And I'm just going to introduce her. Vanessa Beeley is an international investigative journalist. You can follow her on Twitter at Vanessa Beeley. Read her articles on MintPressNews.com and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, thank you for joining me.
You're absolutely welcome. I'm joining you, of course, from Damascus, so right from the heart of what's going on.
Exactly. That's what I thought. I didn't want to assume, but if I remember correctly, there was an issue associated with your car when you were there, and you were reporting when you were there. Basically, the BBC was doing naughty stuff, to put it mildly. No, I remember. Yeah. I totally remember the last segment. Let me ask you this. How are those airstrikes being received in Syria? Meaning from the standpoint of the way the media takes it, the way the political instrument takes it, how is that being appropriated?
Well, I mean, of course, this is standard American coalition strong arm tactics and providing air cover for ISIS, because shortly after these bombing attacks, which killed, I believe, at least 4 of the Iraqi militia that are fighting ISIS in the area. So there is the ultimate irony. The US is actually targeting the very armed forces that are fighting and defeating ISIS. That, of course, America is actually actively enabling, equipping, and arming and allowing to re-infiltrate areas of Syria that they had previously been cleaned out of. And immediately after the bombing raid, ISIS actually took responsibility for an attack on Iraqi power grids and power stations. So clearly, you know, what I see this is on July the 10th at the UN Security Council, there is a vote to either disallow the continuation of the so-called humanitarian aid corridor in Idlib into the al-Qaeda-controlled enclave. And what I see this is strong arm tactics from the US threatening Syria and Russia by saying, okay, if you don't allow the reopening or the continued opening of that so-called humanitarian aid corridor, which sustains al-Qaeda in Idlib, then we will bomb the primary trade entry points from Iraq into Syria and also into Lebanon. Lebanon and Syria, of course, are now 2 countries that are effectively blockaded and besieged by the United States via sanctions.
Explain.
And so this is one of the most important crossing points, Al-Bukamal, between Iraq and Syria.
Right there. Explain that. Meaning you made the point of saying humanitarian, you put it in quotes. Explain what you mean and explain why that would be of significance, where proxies would be used to basically attack in order to kind of influence. Well, what's the importance of it? That's what I'm trying to get across.
I mean, the humanitarian corridors, the majority of them have been closed down with pressure from Syria, China, and Russia at the UN Security Council. There is one remaining humanitarian corridor between Turkey and Syria that is called Bab al-Hawa. Bab al-Hawa is under the exclusive control of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an al-Qaeda rebrand. All humanitarian aid, and I use that term euphemistically because, of course, humanitarian aid can also mean weapons and military equipment, which is supplied to al-Qaeda in Idlib to sustain the war against the Syrian government. But even humanitarian aid comes into Bab al-Hawa. It's seized by al-Qaeda and it is then used as trading revenue. Of course, this is nothing new. America is occupying the oil fields in the northeast, and that is providing revenue both for Al-Qaeda, for the Kurdish separatist proxies, and even for ISIS in the past.
Well, not just that, it also is depriving it from the Syrian government, which is the key point.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And, you know, this means for us no electricity, no fuel, etc. So, I mean, you know, yes, this is part of the hybrid war against the Syrian people, which also, of course, brings in the economic terrorism, which is the barbaric sanction regime that is punishing the Syrian people for resisting this war for 10 years. So for me, the bombing of Abu Kamal, which, as I say, is an important trading point for Syria and Iraq. It's the main entry point that isn't under the control of the United States or the United States proxies, that allows goods to enter Syria from Iraq. So for me, this is a clear message from Biden to Russia, to China, and to Syria, but predominantly to Russia, because it's the Russian veto that will prevent the reopening or the continued opening of Bab al-Hawa in Idlib. It's a message saying, okay, if you don't allow the opening of Bab al-Hawa, we will continue to target the only trading post between Syria and Iraq that is not under our control. Also, the other thing, of course, is that Russia is upholding the decision by Syria to establish humanitarian points in southern Idlib, which is under the control of the Syrian government, in collaboration with WHO and World Food Programme, so that the Syrian government would actually supply humanitarian aid to its own people in Al-Qaeda-controlled Idlib with the help of UN agencies. Of course, that is completely disappeared from Western media, the fact that there is an alternative to the Turkish-controlled cross-border operations.
That's astonishing. You believe that the politics of this is that direct in the sense of do X in order to get Y? Like that this is basically the bombing is a message, a symbol of sorts of saying, don't do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, as I said, immediately after the bombing raid, which, by the way, did kill one child and, as far as I know, injured 3 civilians. Immediately after the bombing raid, ISIS was empowered to carry out attacks against Iraqi electrical power stations, which again is another message that's also saying, okay, Iraq, we will preemptively attack military outposts in Iraq and Syria, military outposts with soldiers that are fighting terrorism, American-backed terrorism, and of course in response to the Iraqi parliament decision that the US should vacate Iraq, that it should leave Iraq. So for me, this is a very clear message from the Biden administration. And let's not forget that they bombed the same area within 30 days, I believe, of Biden being elected president.
So this was the exact same location that Biden bombed where he killed, I think it was like 22 people killed. Wow, they're very interesting. Okay, fair enough. I wasn't aware that those were the same places or the same location. So what do you? So
I mean, perhaps not exactly the same building, but yes, exactly the same location.
And they're called Iranian-backed, basically terrorists. But in the old reporting of the New York Times, they weren't quite sure who these guys were.
You know, this is insane. I mean, Hashd al-Shaabi, the PMU forces, have been the source of stability in Iraq since ISIS tried to invade. The PMU have been defending Iraq, including Baghdad, where, of course, the American, one of the largest American bases in the Middle East, in the Green Zone, is located. The PMU are fighting the terrorism that the US is enabling and expanding in the region. That's the bottom line.
Vanessa, I want to ask something kind of unrelated, but with all the reporting that you've done in the region, this is it's an ongoing process, but it's slightly older news. But I'm just curious, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, like you're saying, the United States is still in and involved in and very, very much occupied in some sense with Iraq. Although clearly more of our attention is placed on China and Ukraine and Syria, but broadly, we're still in that conflict, a war that, you know, we started, and conflict we joined. Anyway, we're in the process right now officially of withdrawing from Afghanistan. Now, we've talked about that, a pivot to China and how moving troops away in one area sort of lightens the load to re-escalate in other areas. But you're another side of this. In some sense, people think about Afghanistan as, okay, this is America's big last war in the Middle East, and finally we're pulling out. But we're still, of course, engaged in and very much supporting fighters in Syria and, yes, in Iraq too, and very, very much active in the region. Looking at the reporting on the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the sort of narrative messaging around this, do you see people thinking that we're withdrawing from the Middle East in a way that we very much still quite aren't, if that makes sense? In other words, we're still definitely in Syria. We're still doing these airstrikes. We're still, plotting and thinking about these things on a regular basis. And in other words, we have not definitively withdrawn from the Middle East, but it seems to me like a lot of folks might be led to believe that by seeing Biden talking about the September 11th withdrawal date. Do you see that too? What's your take on that, Vanessa?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Syria is absolutely pivotal to U.S. Supremacy in the region, absolutely pivotal. And what we've actually seen is an increase in the movement of military hardware into Syria, into the northeast, into the areas that are occupied by the U.S. forces, or the U.S. coalition forces, let's say. And, of course, the training of terrorist groups, including ISIS, and the Al-Tanaf camp, which is closer to the border with Jordan. We've seen greater activity from ISIS. We've seen also greater activity from Russia against new ISIS positions in the northeast. And as I said, we're seeing the US now trying to maintain or sustain Al-Qaeda in Idlib in order to sustain the war against the Syrian government and its allies. So, yeah, for the time being, America is embedded in the region. I tend to say these days that we shouldn't believe anything that any American administration is saying. If it's saying that it's offering concessions or it's withdrawing, look at that with very cynical eyes and look at what it really means, because it very rarely means what they say.
Yeah, it's often a ploy or a feint or something like that. Vanessa, we're basically out of time.
Okay.
But thank you for joining Jamar and I. Really appreciate it. Have a great one.
No problem. Thank you very much.
For those listening, that was Vanessa Beeley, international investigative journalist. Follow her on Twitter at Vanessa Beeley. Read her articles on mintpressnews.com. Also support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Vanessa Beeley. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, going into a break, coming back with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.